My wife and I built a house in the country away from city life in 1978. Our closest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile from our house, and the main country highway, which ran north and south, was 1.5 miles from our house. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked around the house to make sure all the doors were locked and the lights were turned off. As I looked out our living room window, it was pitch black except for the occasional small glimmer of a porch light off in the distance. However, during a full moon, you could see the trees which dotted Cedar Ridge Point, which ran north and south behind our house. You could also see the dirt road which ran east and west from our house towards the main highway. During those nights, you could also make out the crops which were planted on the south and west of our house. Most of the time, the fields were planted with alfalfa and wheat, and the neighbor north of us had grazing pasture for his cattle. The length of our house ran north and south. We had 2 bedrooms, which were in the west side of the house, and my wife and I were in the bedroom on the east side of the house. We had 2 boys who were 8 and 10 on one side of the house, and 2 boys who were on the other side of the house. Our 2-year-old baby would wake up at night, and we would have to fill his bottle or change his diaper, or both. On one of those pitch black nights in the summer of 1982, my wife and I were awakened by the cries of our 2-year-old. And, like so many nights, we were trying to decide whose turn it was to take care of the baby. That night, my wife went out and she stayed in bed, and I reluctantly crawled out of bed and made my way to his room. Like always, I glanced over at the clock on our dresser and saw that it was 2:09 a.m. As I entered our baby's bedroom, my first order of business was to search for his crib, find his empty bottle, fill it with milk, and then return it to his starving mouth. As I felt around in the crib, I finally found the bottle, which was hidden under his blankets, and to my surprise, the bottle was still full. I then placed the bottle into his mouth and his crying magically stopped. I then felt his diaper and found that it was soaking wet, as always. I took his diaper off, put a dry one on, and pulled up his blanket around his chin and headed back to bed. As I turned away from his crib, I looked directly outside of his bedroom window and saw a brilliant white sphere, which seemed to be suspended in the air. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, and sure enough, the ball of light was still hovering in the air. I was so excited that I ran into my bedroom, got my wife, and told her she had to come and see something that was in the field west of the house. I think she thought I was pulling a prank on her until I finally got her into the baby's bedroom. I pointed out the window and said, "Look, look." She looked in the direction that I was pointing and saw the same brilliant white sphere that I was seeing. I was not sure how long we stood there, but it felt like I was in a trance. After some time had passed, we both had a strong feeling that we just needed to go back to bed. It almost felt like we were being pushed from the bedroom to our bedroom. We got back into bed and instantly fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I was furious because I didn't get dressed and run out to where the sphere was. I just kept beating myself up all day and kept asking myself, "What is wrong with you?" I couldn't believe that I would just stare at something so awesome and just waltz back to bed like nothing happened. When I went outside the next morning, I replayed the experience back in my mind and estimated that the sphere that we saw appeared to be a perfect circle and was roughly 30 to 35 feet in diameter. I also estimated that the sphere had been suspended about 25 feet above the ground, and then it just sat there completely motionless during the whole time that my wife and I saw it. I remember seeing that the ground was brightly lit underneath the sphere. I then stepped off the distance from our house to where I thought the sphere was, and it was approximately 150 feet. As I walked around in the alfalfa field, I didn't see that any alfalfa had been disturbed in any way. As I walked back to the house, I decided that I was going to find out what this thing was, no matter what. My first step began when I called all the local radio stations and asked them if any listeners had called in to report seeing anything unusual around 2 a.m. the night before. The answers were all negative, which just increased my frustration. Next, I tried another avenue by calling all of the local TV stations and asked the same question. Again, no positive information was forthcoming. I'm sure that they thought I was some kind of nut job. As my frustration grew, I wondered if I had seen anything at all, or maybe it was a dream. But I wasn't going to let my search for answers be controlled by my frustration. I began to wonder if I was missing something, but I didn't know what that something was. So, off I went on another direction. I had a friend who lived about 5 miles away who was a physics professor at a local college. I sat down with him and explained what I had seen. I then asked him if he would help me discover something earthly that may have caused the brilliant white sphere to appear on our property. So, we went through the following list. 1. Was it the moon? We agreed that it couldn't have been the moon because the moon was in its dark phase and wasn't giving off any light. 2. Type of cosmological event. He indicated that he wasn't aware of any such event, and if there had been, his entire science department would have been there to see it and study it. 3. Was it a weather event like ball lightning? We both agreed that there was no weather disturbances even remotely close to our area. The skies were clear. 4. Could it have been a farmer's tractor lights? We discussed that possibility but came to the conclusion that tractor lights weren't 35 feet in diameter and that farmers weren't normally working their fields at 2 a.m. in the morning. 5. Could it have been aircraft or helicopter lights? I then reminded my friend that the sphere stayed in one position, it was static, and it gave off no sound. He then stated tongue-in-cheek that if it had been an aircraft at my home, we would have been ground zero for a horrible crash. 6. Could it have been swamp gas? We were both laughing due to the fact that we live in a dry desert, and there's no way that swamp gas would have been the cause. 7. Now my friend got personal and asked if my wife and I had been drinking alcohol or using illegal drugs of any kind that night. I said, "No way, you know me way better than that." He agreed and we moved on. 8. We then wondered if some high school kids were just screwing around. We decided that that was much of a dead end as the farmer's tractor light theory. I then began to widen my search by contacting local air traffic control centers. When I spoke with the air traffic control supervisor, I asked if they had seen any unusual aircraft in the longitude and latitude that I gave him between the times that we saw the sphere. He then explained that the radar goes down at 12 a.m. each night, so they wouldn't have seen anything anyway. However, he did suggest that I contact the air traffic control center at the Salt Lake International Airport. He was also kind enough to give me their direct telephone number. Shortly after, I finally contacted the air traffic control supervisor at the Salt Lake International Airport in Salt Lake City, Utah. I told him the same information I did with the previous air traffic controller supervisor. He then explained that their radar reached all the way to the Canadian border and that they hadn't noticed any unusual air traffic at the coordinates and the time that I shared with him. Then he stopped talking and there was a long silence. He then said something that shocked me. "That doesn't mean you didn't see something." That single comment made my search for answers worth all the time and effort that I had spent trying to figure out what that thing was. Later that evening, I received a phone call from Washington, D.C. The man on the other end explained that he was with an unnamed government agency and wanted to ask me a few questions about what I had seen a couple nights ago. I said, sure, I would be glad to help. For the next hour, he asked me every question under the sun. And at the end of the call, he thanked me for my time, and that was it. Looking back on the whole experience, I am positively sure that my wife and I saw something not of this world, or something that was of such curious nature that the United States government wanted to know more about it. Years later, I ran into a retired Air Force officer who claimed to have worked on Project Blue Book. When I went through my story of what I saw, his interest grew. He thought that I had certainly seen something that few people ever get the opportunity to experience. So that is my UFO experience. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lost River Legends. If you enjoyed this episode and you would like to help support the podcast, please share it with others and consider subscribing. Here at Lost River Legends, our primary focus is delivering unique topics, amazing guests, all paired with top-notch production value. The Earth we live on has many hidden secrets, countless paranormal stories, and is filled with amazing, curious humans who are trying to find answers to life's questions. Here at Lost River Legends, we are no different. We believe an active curiosity to the unknown is ingrained in the human experience. We hope you will join us on our journey to explore the lost legends of the Earth by listening to past and future episodes. Until then, James and I wish you health, happiness, and a curious mind. And remember, the clock of life is ticking away.